Some kings come really easy to people. Parenthood was not one of those things for me. It took me a very long time to get pregnant, and then 5 days till I changed my first diaper. I went looking in books, thinking I could read how to be a parent, studying them only to find out that they simply contradicted. So I decided that I would raise my children to the best of my ability, knowing what I knew to be true. I filled their bookshelves with children's books that I believed to be the best that they could be. So I offered them the rainbow fish, the fish that took each of its gills and gave it generously to all of its brothers and sisters so that all fish could be beautiful. The Cat in the Hat, the book that taught young people it was okay and safe to be home by themselves and that they could actually be responsible. The beautiful words of Shel Silverstein in Where the Sidewalk Ends, and one of my favorite, The Rainbow Man and His Journey of Love. And each night while I was tired, we propped them up in their bouncy chairs, just a few months old, and performed the ritual of story time. And on one particular night, I chose this book, Curious George by H.A. Rae. I came to find out later that actually his wife Margaret wrote the book, but they thought a woman's book wouldn't sell in 1941. For the first time, I noticed the cover. 2 plump white policemen escorting a short brown monkey. But nevertheless, I began to read. This is George. He lived in Africa. He was a good little monkey and always very curious. One day, George saw a man. He had a large straw hat, and the man saw George too. What a nice little monkey, he thought. I'd like to take him home with me. So he put the hat on the ground, and of course, George was curious. So he took the large yellow hat. The hat had been on the man's head. George thought it would be nice if I put it on my own head, and he picked it up and put it on. The hat covered George's head, and he couldn't see. The man picked him up quickly and propped him in a bag. George was caught. The man with the big yellow hat put George on a little boat, and a sailor rowed them both across the water to a big ship. George was sad, but still a little curious. On the big ship, things began to happen. The man took off the bag. George sat on a little stool, and the man said, George, I'm going to take you to a big zoo in a big city, and you will like it there. I had heard this story before. It was the story of African capture. So I put the book down. We resumed the rainbow fish. And as the girls slept and my clarity came to me, I reread Curious George with mature eyes. And then the academic in me went searching for scathing dismissals of this racist tale, and I yielded one, by June Cummings. She wrote an astute tale of this Curious George book as a story of benevolent African slavery. She argued that, like so many Africans captured in the Middle Passage, George was enticed by objects of the white man, then taken captive and brought to far-off places that he'd never been before. And when he tried to escape, you'll remember that George jumped overboard. He is then again captured, shackled until they made it to their destination. And upon arrival, he was imprisoned. George first in jail and then in a zoo. So I thought perhaps this is just a tale that went from 1941 to the 1950s, which is all June Cummings focused on, and maybe people really hadn't noticed. So I started reading. There are over 100 Curious George books in 20 different languages. Was the tale still the tale that it was in 1941? And sadly, it was. So each story begins with this fine-looking man. The man in the yellow hat, as though he had stepped out of a National Geographic magazine with his sunny pants and his sunny shirt and his big straw sunny hat, knee-length brown army-style boots, and a pathetic excuse for a father. He's the ultimate deadbeat dad/captor. But George, while the man in the yellow hat was often absent at the middle of the book, George was actually longing to return to his site of capture. There are pictures all over, strewn throughout the books, that actually remind George of the act that captured him at the breakfast table. And throughout the narratives, you'll find George painting and wishing himself back into the jungle. In this instance, he painted the entire man with the yellow hat's house in jungle scenery and painted himself on the jubilant tree of his capture. There are other stories that have him hanging fearlessly onto trees or experiencing moments of happiness among his jungle friends. And this year, he actually traveled back to the jungle, unaccompanied in a rocket ship. Now, perhaps this is just children's literature, kiddie litter as it's referred to. But George's popularity is growing. George has a PBS television station with a whole series and 2 Emmy-winning awards. Now you can stream Curious George on Hulu 24 hours a day. George has several films, a musical, gaming platforms, theme parks. He was Forrest Gump's favorite book. He played a role in the Thanksgiving Day parade as a big balloon in Philadelphia. In 2016, New York City nominated him as their ultimate tourist icon. George is the only literary character in the United States that has a bookstore devoted solely to Curious George. There are endless Curious George activities, museums. George is not fading into oblivion. He's rising in popularity. So why, then, is a character plagued with racism from the beginning free of critique? Surely there have been tons of critiques of Disney and Dora the Explorer and all sorts of children's characters, but George, none. Well, one. So I went looking and reading, and I came up with what I think are probably 2 reasons why George is free of criticism. The first is George is a science teacher. George is known for his curiosity. He wants to know how things work. And so in 2006, when the blockbuster film came out, it was all about how to teach children science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEM. Followed by a PBS special and a museum exhibit called Let's Get Curious. Children were encouraged to learn about STEM through Curious George. In 2012, Google decided they could actually compete in the tablet market if they used Curious George to encourage children to play with technology. That same year, studies came out and indicated that children who engaged with Curious George would become more confident in their ability to use STEM and their parents more comfortable teaching it. Yet George is not about just curiosity. His curiosity is housed in his monkeyness, in his primate being. And science, curiosity, and monkeyness is also what led to slavery. The idea that white men were curious about other places and other species is what led them to explore Africa. And when they did, they determined because the skin and the body type of those who they found there were different and dark, they must have been primates, and then justified their imprisonment and ultimate slavery. A similar narrative is used to describe the slaughter of Native Americans. Science is not ideologically neutral, nor is it value-free. And while we want our kids to be curious, because science has done many good things, we should encourage them to be cautious so that their curiosity does not harm others. But George is not the only one that's encouraging young people to be curious. The government in 2006 decided the reason that we were headed for one of the biggest recessions in 2008 was because we were losing the tech race. And that if we were going to compete, we had a moral obligation to teach young people how to be proficient in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And so while things were being cut here and there on the budget, increased bipartisan support for children learning STEM. Because the belief was that if we were going to be the global leaders we were in World War II, we had to prepare our children. The second reason that George is probably free of criticism is that George survived the Holocaust. See, George is the literary child of Margaret and H.A. Raes. And in 2005, Louise Bourdon wrote a Curious George story like none other. The Journey That Saved Curious George, the wartime escape of Margaret and H.A. Raes. And shortly after her book, the Jewish Museum in New York put out an exhibit. And the Nebraska Institute of Holocaust Education has a traveling exhibit, and all three narratives were roughly the same. They traced the German Jews of Margaret and H.A. Raes from their home in Rio to their elongated honeymoon in Paris. See, they went to Paris for a short stay and found it to be a wonderful place and decided to stay for several years. In 1940, when the Nazis invaded Paris, the Raes left. But this is not the story of Nazi invasion that I read. It's not the story that Anne Frank tells or the horrors of slaughter in Elie Wiesel's Night. It's not the story that killed 6 million of my ancestors. No, this is a whimsical story. It's an adventure tale, a new type of Curious George with lovely pastel pictures and the Raes pedaling across. They were never afraid, always excited for curious adventure. And the story ends with them arriving in the United States and becoming famous for the Curious George book. It's a very Americanization of the Holocaust, one that's free of slaughter and death camps, but one that brings the wonderful work that the United States brought to World War II. And we're at a unique moment in history now as World War II veterans are dying, survivors of the Holocaust are dying. We're at a site of national remembrance, a place in which anything that has to do with the Holocaust is free from criticism. And so George then becomes triply protected. First, he's an icon of childhood nostalgia. Second, he's a promoter of science education. And third, he's a Holocaust survivor. So what do you do with your George books? Well, I don't suggest you ban them, nor do I suggest censorship. Instead, they become an opportunity to teach our children from a young age how to think critically, how to read and then reread, how to analyze, how to question, to ask questions of the book that we read, to understand that the ideologies embedded in even fiction service the present, and to teach our children these acts. On September 17th of last year, Curious George turned 75, and my daughters turned 7. And for each night, when we offer, I hope that I can embolden them the critical thinking capacity that I wish all of you emboldened in your youngest. Thank you.